Hello, everybody. Welcome along. Good afternoon. The Biochemical Society and Portland Press are really pleased to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon. This is part of our Biochemistry Focus webinar series, and topics include different research areas in the molecular biosciences, as well as practical sessions to support career development in each webinar. We're going to give you the opportunity to ask questions, and we welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in our webinar series too. You can check out the website for more details on that. I should introduce myself. I'm Dr Emma Yhnell. I am Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity and Inclusion and a reader in neuroscience at Cardiff University. And it's my pleasure to be chairing this webinar today. Today's webinar is titled Stress Management During a PhD, so a topic that I'm sure many of you will resonate with. I certainly did and do. And our invited speaker is going to be discussing how to spot the signs of stress and share practical strategies to help manage it effectively. So before I hand over to our speaker, just a bit of housekeeping. So questions, feel free to ask them at the end of the webinar or during the talk as well. We should have plenty of time for those. If you do have a question, please type it into the question box as shown in the image on the screen, and we will try to answer as many of those questions as possible. So without further ado, our invited speaker today is Dr. Jeff Clark from the University of Bristol. Jeff obtained his PhD in medical engineering from Imperial College London and is now a research fellow in AI at the University of Bristol and CTO of IngeniumAI, a spin-out company that he founded during his postdoc. During his PhD, Jeff also started the Savvy Scientist, a website dedicated to supporting PhD students with tips, advice and resources to help navigate academic life. And by running this site, Jeff seeks to dispel common PhD myths and empower prospective STEM students with essential information that they need to make more informed decisions about their future. So I'm very much looking forward to this, Jeff. Please do take it away.
Thank you so much, Emma, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. So yeah, as Emma said, we're going to be talking about stress management during the PhD. Emma's actually done a lot of the hard work introducing myself anyway, so I'm not going to speak too long about this. But all I'll say is that I finished my PhD around 4.5 years ago, so not too long ago. So I do still remember the life of a PhD student. And of course, I do spend time trying to help PhD students with my website, The Savvy Scientist. Since finishing my PhD, I actually was a postdoc at the University of Bath for a period of time and decided to pivot actually away from what I was working on during my PhD to a slightly different research area, which then actually became a spin-out company. That could, I think, actually be a whole separate webinar about commercializing and forming companies around your research, but that won't be what I'll be talking about today. But I'm actually now the CEO of the company, so I have a small team of people that I manage there. And alongside that, I'm a part-time research fellow at the University of Bristol, as Emma said. So I know something or two about managing different workloads and dealing with the stresses of different competing interests at the same time. As Emma said, I've got this website, The Savvy Scientist. My motivation for starting this was really that when I was going through my own PhD, I didn't really have anybody to turn to answer, excuse me, to answer questions about PhD life. So I wanted to try and help people who maybe don't have, you know, those people around them that can provide support. So as Emma said, I provide lots of different input, both in terms of helping prospective students to do with applying. Of course, everybody on the call today is already a PhD student, so trying to help support people throughout their journey and also after they finish. So I actually have a whole series called Behind the PhD, Beyond the PhD. Why am I screwing that up? Which is all to do with life after the PhD and what I've done up since then, and also incorporating new people who've shared their own experiences. I also have a resource library on there. Just want to give a shout out to that. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today, I have articles and resources, so you're welcome to check them out. Everything's free. This isn't a spiel to try and get people to sign up for anything that you have to pay for. It's purely just available there for free for everybody to access. So enough about all of that. Of course, it's stress that we're talking about today. So there's going to be 3 different parts of the presentation. The first is trying to dispel some common myths that people might have about PhDs and stress, then talking about common causes and the impact of stress, and then finally touching upon actionable things that you can do to try and reduce the stress during your own PhD. So starting with some myths, these are things that I hear quite a lot from PhD students that I work with in my academic life now, but also during my own PhD. And the first is that people think that PhDs have to be stressful, that, there's no way around it, that, every week you just have to be working long hours and feeling very stressed out, and there's practically nothing that you can do about it. The second of them is that you can't have a work-life balance, that you basically just have to focus your entire life for those 3 or 4 years on the PhD and nothing else. And then finally, still slightly related to all of this, is the idea that caffeine is a requirement. There's no way to be in academia and survive a PhD without it. As you can tell from the framing of this, and that I've called them all myths, my personal belief is that none of them are true, and that you certainly can get through a PhD surviving it without the stress, having a work-life balance, and certainly not needing loads of caffeine. How do I know this? Because I did them all myself. This isn't anecdotal. This is from speaking to lots of other people as well who've navigated the pathway to try and deal with stress and find ways to, balance the workload and enable them to have an enjoyable experience during their PhD. So thinking about the causes and impact of stress during a PhD, I don't need to be preaching to everybody here. I'm sure there's many different things that you can all think of that are the common causes of stress, but here's 4 of the main ones that I could think of. So deadlines and pressures to do with publishing are certainly one of the main things that I've encountered in the past. It can be difficult, especially if you're not in control of some of those deadlines. So if there's certain conferences that are coming up, to have to prepare everything for it, or to balance it with maybe papers and other deadlines and things, that can certainly be a big cause of stress and significant workload. And then of course, secondly, is to do with managing that workload. So if you've got several deadlines at the same time, how do you balance them? How do you find the time for other things that you need to be getting on with, such as, writing a thesis or things going on outside of the PhD? Imposter syndrome, of course, is a big one. It gets spoken about a lot, so I'm not going to dwell too much on it. But certainly when you're starting off the PhD, it can be very intimidating. Within the research group, if you've got more senior researchers and postdocs, and of course your PI, the leader of the lab, it can feel very difficult to, fit in and feel like you've got to kind of prove yourself. And then finally, we've all experienced it. PhD stipends, they might have gone up a little bit recently, but they're still certainly not much of a, cushion to be able to live with. So everything that's, going on with financial pressures, of course, another major cause of stress. But I think something that's quite useful to consider how to frame stress is in terms of what's the cause, and is it internal or external? So internal, by that I mean things that you're putting on yourself. So for instance, if you've got in your head that you want to publish a certain number of papers or achieve things to a certain standard, those are things that I'd say are internal. So maybe, I'm not saying you should lower your standards, but to basically temper your expectations in some way, or try to pace yourself to not think, okay, in this upcoming academic year, I have to publish a certain amount or do a certain number of things. It could be quite useful to take a step back and think, who is the cause of that stress? And if it's self-imposed, maybe there's ways that you can deal with it. And then externally, these can of course be a little bit more difficult to navigate. So if it's your PhD supervisor who's putting some of the pressure on you, other people in the lab, or maybe pressures going on outside of the PhD, these of course will be a little bit more difficult to navigate, but we'll be touching upon ways that you can deal with that stress also. So of course, there's a number of ways that stress manifests itself. So physically, there's a lot of symptoms that I'm sure a lot of us already are well aware of, so I'm not going to dwell too much on these, but things like fatigue and headaches and insomnia. I certainly remember times that I've had some sleepless nights and things, worrying about different experiments or navigating certain situations. So that's a very common cause of stress. Emotionally, of course, it can take a big toll in terms of loss of motivation, anxiety, different mood conditions that you can have. And then finally, behavioral symptoms, so procrastination, avoidance, isolation, maybe withdrawing from social situations or not wanting to engage so much with people in the lab. So these are some of the most common ways that we see that PhD students have stress affect them. And then on top of that, you might be familiar with the idea of burnout. And certainly whenever I've seen stuff going on online to do with PhD students on Twitter or X these days, there seems to be a fair number of people, of course, having quite a bad time with their PhD. And this isn't me belittling that situation, certainly it should be dealt with. But I see that this kind of combination of being overwhelmed, de-energized, perhaps even depressed, is a big symptom of what we see within PhD students. And there are many ways that we can deal with this. So we'll come on to those again shortly. So in terms of what burnout actually is, so the WHO classify it as a syndrome with symptoms of feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job. And it reduces your efficiency. So it's really not something that you want to be happening. But what's I think most sad is that obviously as PhD students, quite often we've selected the topic that we want to work on because we enjoy it and we love it. You know, we want to be really getting involved and getting the most out of the experience. But actually it can be something where people fall out of love with it because of feeling overworked and the kind of symptoms of burnout. So some psychologists have come up with these 12 stages of burnout. So Herbert Freudenberger and Gail North presented this set of 12 stages. And I think what's quite interesting is just how this gradually comes on. So the kind of formation of these stress symptoms can start off quite innocently. So things like feeling overworked and neglecting your needs. And then suddenly it can develop into something extremely serious and something that certainly you don't want to let progress further than is necessary. So anything that you can do to reflect upon these stages and see maybe what resonates with you and trying to address those symptoms early are going to be a big way of mitigating the risks of increasing the stress that you feel during your PhD. And just finally to say, stress, as I said at the start in terms of the myths, it isn't an inevitability. You know, you shouldn't expect that you're going to definitely have to have a stressful PhD. There's a lot that you can do to navigate it, to reduce the burden of that stress. And that's what we're going to come on to now. So the first way of dealing with stress is to set achievable goals. So I know myself, I've had a big problem in the past with taking on too much or feeling like there's a pressure to, set very lofty goals. And so really making sure that you're setting things that are achievable can make sure that you're not on a day-to-day, a week-to-week or a month-by-month basis becoming more and more stressed, feeling like things are further behind. So the four main things that I'd say about setting achievable goals are firstly, to work closely with your supervisor to make sure that what you're thinking of the goals of your PhD align with what they're thinking. So this comes back to those external factors. So if, for instance, your supervisor or your advisor is somebody who is putting the pressure on you to say, look, you need to submit a piece of work for this upcoming conference, or everybody in the research group typically submits to a certain journal, for instance, to maybe check that that's actually appropriate both for your type of project, because of course, as we all know, research groups are quite diverse, working on different topics, but also to make sure that you're setting goals that are actually achievable when they're broken down in different stages. So secondly, if you've already defined some goals that you want to reach, to make sure that the timelines for it are achievable. So this is, for instance, if you're thinking that there's a conference that you want to submit to in, say, 3 months' time, to work back from that and think, okay, how do I make sure that actually happens? And are the week by week goals that you set yourself to kind of break that down actually achievable and something that realistically you could do? Because it's no good putting together a goal and the series of timelines that are necessary to get there and actually thinking there's no way this is going to happen and feeling stressed out before you've even begun. So anything that you can do to actually think this through, make sure that you're actually on track and make sure that you've got something realistic that you can work towards is one of the key things that I would be saying. And your supervisor should be willing to help you with that and tell you when it's not achievable or not realistic, especially because they'll have the experience of supervising previous PhD students and knowing what is actually typical, for what's required to analyze data and deal with different experiments and things that need to get done. And then on that topic of supervisors, it's so important so far. This is the main bit of advice I typically give to any PhD student, is to make sure that you have regular meetings with your supervisor. So I realized that different research groups are arranged in different ways. Some of them typically just have group meetings where everybody sits in a room together, and it's quite typical to maybe present some work there, but it's not always the best environment to ask questions, especially if you're having some self-doubt or you're feeling some stress. So I would say to kind of line up those individual meetings that you can have with them where you can speak more privately and ensure that you're getting the support that you need that's specific to your project. And then finally, again, on the topic of supervisors, is one of my favorite topics, is to make sure that you're open with them. So if things aren't on track, don't feel like you need to sugarcoat it and say, you know, yes, 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 everything's going to plan if it's not, because that's not only going to add to your stress, but it kind of kicks the problem further down the road, meaning that by and large, you're definitely going to feel more pressure and stress the following week or the following month if you're even falling further behind. The next thing that I'd say in terms of reducing stress is maintaining energy levels. So I'm obviously not any of your parents. I'm not going to tell you particularly to eat well, but there's no doubting that nutrition is a big part of building good daily habits that could actually influence how much stress you're feeling. So avoiding lots of sugar, having balanced meals, these types of things. Caffeine I mentioned earlier, which comes up on the next point about sleep. You know, all these things that are worth taking a step back every so often just to make sure that you're doing things in a way that's setting yourself up for success, so that you're not feeling the burden of undue stress, but also that you can, you know, make the most of your PhD experience. I mentioned sleep as well. So, you know, there's no reason that a PhD student shouldn't be able to get, I'm not going to define a certain number, but, you know, a reasonable amount, 7 to 9 hours, let's just say, of sleep. During my own PhD, I felt that, of course, because we've got some freedom in terms of flexible hours and things typically, and don't just see that as a negative. You know, some people just think, oh, flexible hours, that means I have to work long hours and work weekends. I would push back on that and say that actually every chance that you've got to structure your PhD, which is the next point, more like a full-time job. So don't think of that negatively, just think of it in terms of, you know, you should be within roughly normal office hours, be able to achieve everything that's required to finish your PhD. So don't feel like you should be taking on the stress and the burden of having to work additional hours regularly, you know, to get the thing done. Of course, if there's a certain deadline, that might be required every so often, but that should be, you know, not the norm, basically. And then finally, work-life balance. So we talk a lot, of course, about, you know, the pressures of PhD life and how, you know, it takes a lot of time. I've, of course, just said that you should be able to work, you know, within normal hours. Personally, that's something that I really try to stick to just think this is a 9 to 5 job as much as possible, nothing in the evenings, nothing at the weekends related to work, which should, in theory, give you a lot of time to have a life outside of the lab. So I think this is a big thing that lots of PhD students really probably don't take the most out from. So, you know, there is a lot of opportunity to get involved with other things that are going on. And that actually brings me on to another of my favorite topics, which is student societies and clubs. So I've actually got some pictures here. There's a lot that you can get involved with, and a lot of people overlook the opportunity to get involved with these social activities during the PhD, thinking it's all just for undergraduates. That's not true. So as a PhD student, you can get involved with all of the clubs and societies and things going on with the Students' Union, just as you would as an undergraduate. And this is a really nice way of getting to meet people, and a good number of PhD students go along to these things, but to detach yourself from the work, have some fun, and actually also lead to a much more memorable PhD rather than something where you've just spent all of your time in the lab or analysing data. You've got something where you can look back on it and think, actually, I had a really good time there and learned a lot. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about all of this, but these are some of the things I did during my PhD. So I was actually involved and actually became the president of the Environmental Society at Imperial. So we organised loads of different events and things. We did some beekeeping, which is that pitch that you can see second from the top on the left. And then we had a small garden. So we organised events there, did some food growing, got outside, did some exercise. It was all great. But also you can try things that you don't necessarily want to do longer term, but you just want to have the chance to maybe just try something new. So I tried gliding, went on some surfing trips, which I'd never done before. That is not a picture of me. I'm not a good enough surfer for that to be a picture of me, but that was a picture from one of our trips. And then finally, probably the most unusual one was scuba diving. So I'd never done it before, but I thought actually they've got a club, it's subsidized, it's much cheaper than if I was to try to do this outside of the PhD. So join the club, and there is me outside the Royal Albert Hall, dressed up in the scuba diving gear because we were going to the local swimming pool nearby, which I feel is like quite an unusual set of circumstances. So moving on in terms of the ways to reduce stress, managing your mental health is the next major one. So that of course relates to this whole idea of workload and things like this. But there are some common strategies that you can try and take in to reduce the burden of stress by better managing your mental health. So of course, things like exercise are a major way to do that. Simply taking breaks and trying to, go for a walk at lunchtime or midway through your work is a perfect way of trying to incorporate that and let your mind kind of relax and concentrate on something else for a period of time. And you get bonus points, actually, I would say, if you're commuting and getting exercise at the same time. So these days, I commuted into the office today, and I just feel like it's a perfect way of both having a break from work, making sure that you switch off, because unlike if you're on the train or a bus or whatever, of course, you can be tempted to be reading a research paper and things. You can't safely do that while you're running or walking or cycling into the office. So that can be a really good thing to do. And then secondly, to find your own ways to relax. So I've mentioned here meditation and reading books and things. This could also, of course, be any other form of, instruments, playing a piano, things like this, taking up sports, whatever you want to do to be able to relax. But I think it's so crucial to find something that you can kind of use to switch off from the pressures of the PhD to reduce your stress levels. And then finally, to kind of, there's going to be other people working in your research group or in the department, or at least at the university, who are going through some of the same pressures of a PhD. So even if the research group is quite small, I'm sure there'll be events at your university that are for networking, for early career researchers, or postgraduate research days, things like this. So use these as opportunities to expand your social circle and find other people who are maybe having similar experiences, and you can talk it through with them. And then finally, don't overlook the idea that you can, use your supervisor for support. I've certainly met a lot of PhD students where they feel like they can only really go to the PhD supervisor when they've got some results to show. But you can certainly, you should, be open to them and say, look, I'm feeling some pressure here, and they should be able to help support you through that, to either find ways to mitigate it and maybe, reduce the workload, or help provide some support for maybe how to analyze the data or carry out some experiments, or advice for how to write up your first paper. But also more broadly than that, if you've got financial pressures or caregiving responsibilities, it's good to be open with them and get the support from them. So I mentioned the idea of reading fiction here in terms of taking time to relax. And this is something actually I took up during my own PhD. I'd previously overlooked fiction. I'd thought of it as just a useless activity. I'd rather just read non-fiction books so I can learn some things. How naive I was, though, because it's such a good opportunity to find yourself in a kind of fantasy world, or in a new environment, basically, that you can kind of use to imagine as you're reading the book. And I find that a great way to kind of take some time off from work. And sometimes I would just bring a book to work, have a 5-minute break every so often, and just read a couple of pages of the book. And it was a great way to take a break from the work, but as soon as I come back, I'm re-energized and with better mental health. This is a very, very small plug, which I'm not going to dwell too much on. But I actually submitted an article to Science about this idea of reading fiction books. And this isn't to boast. This is just to basically say that opportunities like this, most people aren't aware of. So Science and Nature both have working life columns, which are to do with these types of ideas to support people working in academia. So if you've not considered it, certainly do take a look. The process was absolutely nothing like submitting a normal academic paper. So it's something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, but it's a great opportunity. I have people all over the world reaching out to me afterwards. And I've written this article here that's available on my website to try and give some information about how the process works, both for Science, but also some input from somebody who did the same in Nature. So for me personally, in terms of stress, I feel like the workload is a big part of what causes stress. And staying organized is a major way that you can become on top of that. So of course, there's no getting around the fact that if the workload is too high, being organized isn't going to be the solution. We already covered ways that you can do that, navigating achievable goals with your supervisor. But staying organized is a key way that you can really make the most of ensuring that you're staying sane and that you're not feeling the pressures of stress during your PhD. So that starts with putting together a plan. So we mentioned this before about the goals and working back, but to make sure that these are actually achievable, I've said it before and I'll say it again, there's no point at all putting together a plan that's not achievable. So to break those down into smaller, you can do kind of month to month week to week, and then even daily tasks can really potentially help to keep you on track. Which brings me very nicely onto the second point. I'm not going to prescribe certain tools. I've mentioned Notion here, but there's many out there. But basically just to say, breaking things down into smaller tasks can help a lot. So I personally have a daily to-do list, which I found very, very useful to work through. And it makes sure that you're chipping away slowly at these big tasks. Because otherwise, if you just say, publish a paper, publish a paper somewhere, it's very tempting for that to just become too much of a big task that you just never want to make a start on. Whereas if you say, okay, I need to produce this set of results, I need to analyze this set of data, I then need to write the methods chapter, I need to et cetera, write it all up, you can then break it down into smaller manageable tasks that actually suddenly become half an hour or so each, something that you can do in a much smaller manageable time frame, and something that you can actually see the progress that you're achieving them over time. Good data management. This is a major problem, I feel like. A few times I did have some stress during my PhD. It was sometimes because I'd misplaced some data, or I had folders full of different sets of results, and I just thought, what on earth is going on here? Which of these do I need to be looking at? So everything that you can do to stay organized in terms of organizing your data, keeping good notes about your experiments as well, so that you can be sure that when you've actually collected all of your results, you know exactly what were the conditions, what was going on in the certain sets of experiments. So there's nothing worse than having some confusion of not knowing what relates to what, and you certainly can't reproduce them and be able to publish the results. So please make sure that you're taking enough time to actually organize yourself so you're set up for success and not having that stressful situation. And then finally, structuring your time. So we've already spoken about tracking tasks, but make sure that you block out your time in a way that makes sense to you. So again, I'm not going to prescribe certain things, but if you find yourself getting distracted maybe with meetings that are going on that you feel like you should probably go along to, or certain seminars and things, by all means, do make sure that you take the time to do these things that aren't directly related to your PhD, but make sure that you also carve out enough time where you're not going to get distracted. You can get on with some deep work, read those papers that maybe you've meant to read for the past couple of weeks, but you've just kind of not had time for, so that you can make sure that over time you're kind of making progress towards all of the different things that need to be achieved to get those goals completed. Procrastination. Okay, there's no way I could talk about stress and workload and things without talking about procrastination. So as we all know, it can be very tempting to procrastinate, but this makes obviously the pressure of getting everything achieved even worse, because you find that you've got less time to get the same amount of things done. So anything that we can do to tackle procrastination is going to help mitigate and reduce the symptoms of stress. So there's a book that's listed at the bottom here by Dr. Linda Sappending and Jack McGuire, which talks through this idea of 6 types of procrastinator. So this is kind of grouping things into different ideas. So we start with the worrier. So this is the person who believes that they won't succeed for some reason. Then we've got the perfectionist, who worries that he won't complete the task perfectly. As we all know, perfect is the enemy of done. So that can be a big problem for a lot of people. The overdoer, who takes on too much. I've certainly experienced that in my past PhD and time until now. The crisis maker. So this is the person who believes that they need that last minute pressure to actually get the work done and complete it. I'm sure if we don't recognize it in ourselves, we can recognize it in other people. But I think these last two are quite interesting as well. So the dreamer, this is the person who sees the task as boring and believes their goals can be achieved without hard work. And then finally, the defier. So this is the person who thinks that the task isn't worthy of their time and they shouldn't have to do it. So maybe if you take a moment now to think about which of those types you might relate to yourself. And I can certainly see myself, reflecting 2 of them. So the perfectionist, I find myself sometimes feeling like, I want to do everything to the highest standard, but I'm now trying to come to terms with the idea that, look, it's much better to get it 70 or 80% of the way there, not striving for perfection, but certainly in situations where you need to have input from other people. So when I published my first paper as a PhD student, I was wasting so much time thinking I want to get it perfect before I send it to the co-authors and my supervisor and people. And I didn't have the experience of publishing, so it was just a goal that was probably never going to get reached. I would never feel like it was perfect. So in hindsight, what I wish I had done is sent a much earlier draft to somebody, probably the supervisor, and have that as a way to both have a deadline to work towards, but also ensure that I'm not wasting too much time, because ultimately there's a chance that what you're trying to perfect isn't the direction it should go in. So if you earlier speak to people, have their input, that can help to drive the direction of the work and ensure that you're not wasting time doing something that's not useful, which can of course then lead to further stress because you feel like you've wasted time that shouldn't have been spent, and also had the additional issue of now having to get more done in less time. And then secondly, the overdoer. So this is certainly something that I still struggle with now. I struggle with saying no, especially in research where it can be so interesting to collaborate with other people, have opportunities to get involved with maybe new research areas, apply for small project funding together, write papers. It's very difficult to say no, and that's something that I see myself, still having issues with. So this is not a solved thing, but the main thing is to just at least recognize what's going on and try and take steps to either mitigate it or at least just come to terms with it so that you can then recognize it and deal with it in the future. There are many ways that you can reduce the symptoms and the issues of procrastination, and no matter which of those 6 types of procrastinator you might recognize in yourself, I think it's fair to say that all of these can help them. So as I said before, breaking down tasks into smaller subtasks can be a really big way of helping to stop procrastination, because as I said, if you've just got this lofty goal of trying to complete an entire piece of work, maybe a new set of experiments that you've not used that equipment before or that certain technique, it can be so intimidating and it's so tempting to think that you should work on other things. But if you just break it down into smaller tasks to just say, look, I'll spend a small period of time maybe speaking to somebody, doing some induction, reading papers, seeking help, doing some pilot study, maybe some initial experiments that you just don't have any pressure to get right. Things like this can really help to make sure that you're making that progress that you need to over time. Some of us might already be familiar with the Pomodoro technique. So this idea is breaking down your day into smaller chunks. So you can do something like 25 minutes of focused work and then have a small break of 5 or 10 minutes, something like that. I'm personally not a fan of prescribing it certainly being 25 minutes. So if there's a task that you really don't want to do, even 25 minutes might be too much. You might want to procrastinate against doing that. So I would suggest maybe if it's something you really don't want to do, just 5 minutes. 5 minutes is so much better than no minutes. You should remember all the time, anything is better than no progress at all. And sometimes minutes might not even be the best way of framing it. So you might say, I just want to write a paragraph for this, paper that you're writing, or even a few sentences, whatever makes you get started. So the whole idea is removing that barrier of getting started and seeming like, if you're committing in old times maybe to writing something for the whole day, you can, and which is enough to make you procrastinate, you can use it as an opportunity to just think, no, I'll just do a small amount and I'd rather get that achieved rather than nothing at all. So that's something that I found really, really useful, and I still use it to this day. There's certain tasks where I just think, oh, I do really want to have to deal with that. I'll just find something else to do. Whereas if you just think, no, I'm just going to do a small amount of it, and then you can have a bit of a break, is a really good way of dealing with it. And then finally, in terms of deadlines and accountability, I mentioned already the idea of self-imposed deadlines or things that maybe you can, be accountable to your supervisor for. But you can also find other means of support. So as I said, this could be maybe your peers, other people in the research group, or even outside of the academic life. You can find ways to make sure that you've got somebody that can hold you to account, to make sure that as long as the goals are achievable, somebody who can be helping you to achieve these things. I've created a kind of printout of these 12 or of these 3, but also 9 other ways to help tackle procrastination that's available on my website. I'm not going to keep plugging it, but just to say that there are resources available there. And then finally, in terms of ways of reducing stress, the main way that I'd say that a lot of people might overlook is staying motivated. So it can be very easy to get lost in the day-to-day pressures of the PhD. And so focusing on, what's important really, to think, okay, you might be getting stressed out about some very, specific detail of what's going on. And this isn't to belittle that. Certainly you should, consider how to deal with it, but also to take a step back and maybe think about what you're hoping to achieve both during your PhD. So taking a step back and thinking what are the high level things you want to get done, but also what you'd like your life to look after the PhD. So here I've got an image showing different things that people might be thinking about after the PhD. And this can be quite useful to having something to look forward to, but also to helping to see kind of the bigger picture outside of that stress that you're feeling at this moment in time. Moving on. So I think not enough people kind of take credit for what they've already achieved. And so you might not feel like you're, particularly far through the PhD, depending on, of course, where you are. But it's so important, I think, to take stock of what you've already achieved and make a success of it, basically. So this can be something that can become a positive experience to both have a break from what you've got yet still to do and that stress, but also to make you realize, as we said, the bigger picture and helping you to realize that you have achieved a lot already, even if you don't realize it. So this is a little task for everybody to do, maybe outside of this, is to think about a few things that you've already achieved during your PhD that you're proud of. And here's a couple of ideas. It could be simply just coming up with new ideas for experiments, learning about new techniques, maybe from research papers or something that you've developed yourself, or a fear. So things like public speaking, a lot of us don't enjoy. I'm actually a bit nervous at the moment presenting this. And it's something that a lot of people have some fear around, which of course can feel stressful. But just think back to the times that you've maybe had those experiences and looking back in hindsight, how you were able to overcome that fear and achieve it. And then related to this is the idea of rewarding accomplishments. So I said before about how you should be able to manage the workload and achieve everything that you need during the PhD in terms of office hours, so 9 till 5 or 10 till 6, whichever hours you kind of like, but something in the kind of 37 or 40 hours a week territory. So do make sure to take breaks from your work, and this could be a reward of stuff that you've already done, but also to basically balance your workload in such a way that you can deal with the pressures that come with the PhD. So as I say here, this could be things like taking a break after you've achieved something, so maybe submitted a paper or, well, I'm not going to prescribe it, whatever achievement you feel like is worthy of a break. And then also treating yourself to a meal or going for a, going to the movies or whatever it is that you fancy doing. Just make sure that you're bringing this back to the kind of self-care, mental health, taking care of yourself angle, because there's nothing worse than feeling like you're just got your head down, focusing on finishing up the PhD, but not taking time to recognize what you've already achieved and rewarding yourself for it. I think this is a really important one, so we're going to finish up here, which is in terms of defining success differently. So it's so easy to focus on just the outcomes, but a little bit like what we were saying about the Pomodoro technique, it's really important to see that you've achieved something by looking at the kind of journey that you're going across and the actions to get there. So to concretely say this, rather than maybe thinking of it has to be that you achieve a certain number of papers and things, of course they're useful, but to instead reframe it in terms of success would be committing yourself to the underlying work that's required to get there and breaking that down into the tasks of spending a certain amount of time conducting the experiments and things, but also enabling you to see success in terms of the path rather than the actual end destination. And then finally, I see this a lot, is that certain PhD students maybe see other people in the research group or in other research groups publishing in certain places or achieving certain things with their PhD. It's so important to recognize that every PhD is different, and therefore it's not possible to say, oh, just because somebody else is publishing things here or they're presenting at some fancy conferences or whatever it might be, I'm a failure if I'm not achieving that. That is not true. Of course, we should all be striving to try and do the best work that we can, but there's no point trying to shoehorn what you're doing into something that maybe isn't appropriate. And also every PhD student has different collaborations. Maybe that student had access to data at the start of their PhD. Maybe there was some existing partnership going on with some other people. So it's very difficult from the outside to see exactly what's going on, but just make sure you're not comparing yourself to those people because what's successful for you might be quite different to other people. Okay, so to start thinking about wrapping this up, so what we've covered today are these main points. So many of the PhD myths to do with stressful situations are not true. As I've said, it's simply not a requirement for PhDs to be stressful. A lot of people sadly do fall into the situation of it being stressful, but hopefully some of what we've covered today will help mitigate some of that. So you can hopefully now recognize some of the signs of stress and also burnout, which is, of course is this gradual process where you can see yourself innocently starting off, but then slowly it builds into something very deliberating. And then secondly, or thirdly, I'm sorry, I should say, reflecting on what's causing your stress and really thinking about what's personal to you and trying to think about what's those key causes. Are they external? Are they internal? And what you can do to try and basically achieve a better work-life balance and mitigate some of that stress. And then finally, all of these actions that we've spoken about, so making sure that you've set achievable goals, working closely with your supervisor, trying to get exercise, manage your mental health, etc. There's a lot of different things to consider here. So this has not been everything that I've covered here today, but I hope it's a useful starting point to enable people to recognize stress and ways that you can mitigate it and lead to a more stress-free PhD. So with that, thank you very much, everybody, for listening. I'll now take any questions that anybody might have. Thank you.
I'm back. Thank you, Jeff. Really useful, I think, for everyone, not just PhD students, that talk. So thank you so much. We can now welcome questions for Jeff. So if you do have a question, please just type it into the question box, and the image on the screen will help you with that. It provides some further instructions. And I'll kick us off, Jeff, if I can, by just asking about how you think those stress levels might vary over the course of a PhD, because people may be undertaking 3, 4, 5, perhaps even longer, maybe part-time PhDs. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes, it's such a good point. So I certainly wouldn't expect it to just be flat throughout the PhD. Typically, people would think it maybe gets more stressful over time. I think there's an argument to say maybe, certainly writing up the thesis can be a stressful experience. But I wouldn't like to define something to say, year by year, there's a certain amount of stress. But I'd certainly say that it goes through ebbs and flows. There's a lot of talk of it being like a roller coaster. There's going to be highs, and there's going to be lows. But I think it depends so much on the PhD student's specific situation in terms of the pressures of maybe certain experiments and deadlines and things that they might have. But yeah, I think it's so important to recognise that it does vary a lot throughout the course of the PhD.
Absolutely, and picking up on that variability then, so lots of your talk focused on that really important relationship with your supervisor, and I think that's so vital. And some of the questions I get as an academic supporting PhD students is, how can I manage my supervisor? They're not very welcoming, maybe they're a bit scary. Do you have any top tips on that? Because that can be a real source of quite a lot of stress sometimes.
100%, yeah, I fully agree. I think actually it's probably the most stressful relationship academically that people have during their PhD is the one with their supervisor. There's many different ways to go about it. So I think firstly to just find a way that works between yourself and the supervisor. I know that doesn't sound very concrete, so to say that a bit more specifically, having frank conversations with them every so often I think goes a long way to making sure that, if you need support and you're not getting it, that it's addressed ideally quite early on. So if it doesn't seem like they're providing the support that you need, trying to say to them, look, you are my primary supervisor. I appreciate that you have your own life going on and have own things that you need to deal with, but finding ways that they can maybe support you. I don't like the idea personally of people kind of pawning their PhD students off on postdocs or other people like that all of the time. But if it's a specific question of maybe how to conduct some experiments and things that people have, it's really good to ask those questions of the supervisor to help them to put you in the best position of maybe speaking to other colleagues and people who can help. But yeah, there's no getting around the fact that it is a cause of big trouble and stress for people. It's often too late, of course, by the time you've started to say, you should have found a better supervisor because, simply not possible. So I think anything that you can do to make better the relationship that you have with them is a big thing that you can ideally, tangibly and actionably do during the PhD that will help with your stress. And like I said, otherwise, trying to find other support mechanisms. So speaking to other PhD students, going along to postgrad research days and things like that might be taking place to, find other forms of support. But your supervisor really should be supporting you. And if not, that should be something that's ideally, I think, addressed.
Thank you. And those really important skills development opportunities, actually, people management and how to work with different personalities and different people as well. And I think one of the key things is selling those as those transferable skills as well. I know you, over the course of your career, have done that quite successfully with spin-outs, etc. as well. So those key transferable skills. And one of the things you also focus on in your talk was comparing, and I'm certainly guilty of the comparison trap. I think, you know, the world that we live in with social media in particular leads us to compare a lot. So do you have any tips in terms of how people might be able to not fall into that comparison trap? It's hard, isn't it?
It's very difficult, and I still feel it as well, Emma. It's not just you. I mean, I find myself sometimes thinking, gosh, that person's so much more successful than I am. What am I doing wrong? I think firstly to see that there are different forms of success. I know this sounds a bit corny, but you know, there are different things that you can be doing that are equally successful. We all, of course, focus on papers as one of the big metrics of success, but I think there's other ways that you can go about that, other forms of impact that you can have, outreach, you know, spin out companies, whatever it might be, other things that maybe you're spending your time on that other people aren't. But also it just comes back to this idea of every PhD is different. So if we were all undergraduates, all taking the same biochemistry undergraduate, you know, you could agree potentially that we are all measured by the same yardstick. Given that a PhD is so different for every single person, we've all got different projects that we're working on, all got different levels of funding, if there's different grants and things that people are working on as well with their supervisors, different forms of support. So all research groups are differently sized. Some of them have got, you know, postdocs and more senior PhD students to support them. Of course, there's issues with collaborations and partnerships and things like this. So it might not be useful to people, but I just say try as much as possible to recognize that you cannot compare yourself to other people because everybody has got a different PhD and their journey is different. I don't know if that's a kind of complete answer, but that's at least the way that I try and sometimes take a step back and recognize the situation.
No, I think that's great. We've had a question in, Jeff, that asks about how we might be able to identify students who are particularly at risk from struggling with stress during their PhDs, both as supervisors and I think as peers in the community. So do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yes, so we covered some of the symptoms that people might be able to recognize. So on an individual basis, of course, there's things like people withdrawing. Maybe they were quite engaged with social situations and things like this before. So I think that's something that's very useful for people to try and recognize, maybe in trying to support people, other people in the research group who are maybe potentially going through these things. But I think also systematically, of course, there are always going to be issues depending on the dynamics of different research groups. So depending on, of course, the size of it and other things that are going on, it's possible that there might be groups of people who are maybe feeling more pressure than others simply because of the way that, for instance, the supervisor arranges the research group and things like this. So I think there's going to be, it's difficult to say concretely, but I think there's certainly something in the idea of this supporting each other and recognizing the symptoms. So hopefully we've covered them in enough detail today for people to see what some of the signs of stress look like. And of course, we cover the stages of burnout. So to go into those and think about, you know, what do we recognize in ourselves and maybe that we've seen in other people and things that you can do to help support that person or help support yourself to navigate it a bit better.
Great, thank you. Next question relates to setting goals for things like writing, I think particularly in that write-up stage. So somebody's asking about whether there might be any particular recommendations around the number of daily writing hours that you might
have. So I said earlier about, you know, 5 minutes are better than no minutes. I wouldn't like to prescribe certainly to say that somebody needs to spend 6 hours or whatever it is to, you know, writing. I think it's very difficult to say that without knowing, of course, you know, how much you enjoy writing. Personally, I quite enjoy it. So I think that's quite a difficult thing to be able to prescribe, but also it's about, I think, working back from the end. So to think, okay, if you need to submit your thesis on the 31st of August, let's just say, what needs to happen by that point? So if you want to spend, you know, a month a chapter or something like that, for instance, what's going to need to happen to get those things achieved and to break that down into daily tasks? So Personally, I find that's the easiest way of figuring it out. But like I said, really don't aim for perfection, especially for that first draft. Just to get words down on the paper is already a success, and it's something that you've achieved compared to having nothing written down. And it's so useful to use that to then iterate and be able to actually make improvements.
And thinking about where you write as well can sometimes be quite helpful if you want to change up the environment of writing too, because as you say, it's a skill that some people prefer to others, right? Question around learning new techniques now, and I think this is something that lots of people might identify with being a particularly stressful thing because they're new things, they're novel, they maybe are techniques that we haven't experienced before that might be going wrong. So this question asks about navigating that and whether we might allocate particular days to learning new techniques and how we might go about navigating newness.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think certainly that's a great idea to potentially chunk it into saying, okay, Thursdays are going to be the day where you either read papers to learn new techniques or have inductions or spend some time in the lab learning new things. It is very personal. So like I've said several times by now, I find it difficult to prescribe exactly the right technique because it really does vary person to person. Sometimes it might make sense to spend a longer period of time, maybe if something's particularly complicated and maybe requires some setup, if it's a new experiment and things, might take some time to get into. So maybe it's once a month, spending a week, something like that. It really depends on the structure of what works best for the individual, but certainly making sure to carve that time out, especially as you say, Emma, if somebody's finding it quite intimidating and you think, oh gosh, what if it goes wrong? And if you break the piece of equipment, things like this. But also on that topic, it's worth recognizing that things do go wrong, and that is normal. So of course, take as much care and due diligence as you can to not break things and set the experiments up in the best way. I don't want any supervisors getting in touch with me saying that I told people to just not worry about breaking things, but it's normal to go through a kind of learning phase. So anything that you can do to maybe learn safely, so to speak, so maybe working with somebody else, once you've had the induction, feel free to go back to that person, say, look, I'm not really sure how to use this NMR or whatever the piece of equipment is. Anything that you can do to help make yourself at ease, but also just make sure that you're getting stuck in as soon as possible. So I think it's so easy to procrastinate and think, no, I'll put that off for another week until I'm feeling more comfortable. But sometimes doing is the main thing that needs to happen to get you started.
And I think with that procrastination thought, I think we've probably all experienced times where we've put something off, dreading it, both, within studying and also, I know I should be doing chores around the house at the weekend and I put them off. But actually, they're not maybe as bad as we perhaps feared once we do them. So getting over that can be sometimes a bit of a challenge. And I think one of the things you picked up on there was really just testing things out, working out what works for you as an individual in a very kind and non-judgmental way, because we're all individuals, right? And we will vary quite significantly in the way that we do things and the way that we tackle problems.
Yep, absolutely. I fully agree there. And that's why I've said a couple of times I don't want to prescribe certain things, because it is, as you say, so personal. And what works for the other 3 people in the PhD group, for instance, might not be what works for you. So don't feel like you need to stick with a certain way of doing things. I think it's always important to carve out that time to try new things, not just in terms of the research that you're doing and experiments and things, but also to figure out what's the best way of working and how do you write best. And you mentioned, Emma, about different working environments. Maybe the office is a little bit noisy, so maybe people want to go to the library or a coffee shop or whatever. Try these things out every so often just to find what does work best for you.
Yeah, that's great. I think one of the first hurdles is actually just being open about how we're feeling, isn't it? Particularly in PhDs. So I'm aware of the time. I'm going to put you on the spot, Jeff, and ask if you've got one top tip that listeners could take away from this webinar in terms of managing stress during their PhD. I know we've covered loads, but if you had one particular favourite, what would it be?
Oh, okay. I do feel on the spot now. I think certainly the relationship with the supervisor is such a big part of the PhD. It's difficult to overlook. that. So along with, of course, trying to recognize, I realize I'm potentially giving more than one answer here, but along with recognizing the symptoms of stress and ways that you can deal with it, I think to really make sure that you've got a solid relationship with the supervisor. So I see that as really one of the big sources of stress for PhDs for people. So as much as you can do to kind of break down that barrier that people might have is a big thing.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for your talk today. I just want to wrap up by saying thank you to everybody. Thank you, Jeff, for such an inspiring talk. I think that would be really helpful with kind of practical things for people to take away as well. So thank you. Thanks for attending. You can continue this conversation online, so you can follow @BiochemSoc on Blue Sky or X. And we also welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in this Biochemistry Focus webinar series. So if you do have any ideas for a webinar in 2025, we invite you to submit a proposal for an upcoming webinar, and you can find more information about that on the screen now. In addition to that, all of the upcoming webinars are listed over on the website. If you've missed any, there's more than 100 to catch up on, and you can watch them again over on the website and the YouTube channel. So if you are looking, excuse me, for anything in particular, check them out, but don't use them as procrastination necessarily, as we have learnt today. The recording of today's webinar is also going to be available to watch within the next couple of weeks as well, if you wanted to catch up on it. So finally then, just to highlight, more important than ever to stay connected and engage with your fellow molecular bioscientists. You can join the Biochemical Society's community of researchers and specialists and take advantage of lots of great benefits, things like discounted registration fees for courses and meetings, and exclusive access to a wide range of grants and bursaries, things like access to journals as well. Excuse me. So do pop on over to the website to find out more information about that. So thank you again for being with us this afternoon. I hope it was useful to you all. It's certainly been very useful to me as well, and I'm not even a PhD student. So thank you again, Jeff. Thank you to Lucy and all the folks behind the scenes as well, providing us with technical support. And we will see you again soon. Thanks, everybody, and bye for now.
Bye, everyone.